Ouais. C'est beau. Okay. You're all good.
We can start. It's okay. It's quarter.
J'ouvre maintenant la séance.
The meeting is now called to order. But before we start, I would like to say something concerning last week's meeting and what happened at the end of that meeting. On my personal behalf and on behalf of all members of this committee, we want to apologize to our nice colleague, Alexis Brunel Duceppe. That is not going to happen again. We also want to apologize to all interpreters. That happened. That is not going to happen again.
I will excuse on my behalf and on behalf of all the colleagues in this committee to our colleague Alexis Brunel Duceppe and all the interpreters. Maintenant, on commence.
Now we shall start. But let me add something. I would like to ask all members of this committee to avoid side conversations.
And is not according to the rule of this committee. So it will be not accepted. Please respect, starting from myself and all the colleagues, the rule of the committee must be respected. Bienvenue à la réunion 44.
Welcome to meeting number 44 of the Subcommittee on International Human Rights of the House of Commons Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development. Today, we begin our study of Jimmy Lei's detention in Hong Kong. And next week, there's going to be a second meeting. We'll take a few minutes at the end to talk about that. To ensure that the meeting runs smoothly, I would like to convey some instructions to witnesses and members of parliament. Before you take the floor, please wait for me to call your name. If you are participating via video conference on Zoom, click on the microphone icon to activate your microphone. Please mute yourself when you are not speaking. Regarding interpretation, for those on Zoom, you have the choice at the bottom of your screen between the floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. In accordance with our routine motion concerning connection test, let me inform the subcommittee that all witnesses have completed the required connection test required prior to the meeting. Now, I would like to welcome the witnesses who have joined us today. Mr. Sébastien Lei, appearing by video conference. Duty Street Chambers, Mr. Lei's legal team. We have Miss Keelan Gallagher and Mr. Jonathan Price, counsel. From the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, Mr. Luc de Pulfort, co-founder and CEO. Ms. Chang Ching Kwong, Senior Analyst, Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China. From Hong Kong Watch, Ms. Catherine Lung, Policy Advisor. Thank you for joining us today. You'll have a maximum of 5 minutes for your remarks, after which we'll open the floor to questions from the subcommittee members. I'll let you know when you have a minute left. We'll start with Mr. Sebastien Lay. Welcome, Mr. Lay. You have the floor for the next 5 minutes. You may begin.
Sure.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm very grateful to be able to testify in front of all of you about my father's ongoing show trial. Before I start, I wanted to thank you all for the unanimous consent motion that was passed, asking for my father to be freed. Hong Kong is a litmus test of how China views the values of the free world. For years, Hong Kong has been a city with a dual status. Its institutions were once grounded in the rule of law under Beijing's autocratic regime. The hope was that China would eventually adopt Hong Kong's systems and it would grant civil liberties for its people. Instead, many Chinese and Hong Kong elites now hold foreign passports to be protected by these freedoms in free countries while they crack down on them at home. In contrast, my father has chosen to stay in Hong Kong and not turn his back on his principles he has championed for over 30 years. Those that underpin freedom and democracy. At the age of 76, the price of doing the right thing is he now faces a sham trial that could see him in prison for the rest of his life. My father is currently on trial on trumped-up charges and under a national security law designed to silence all dissenting voices. Since the Tiananmen Square massacre of 1989, my father has been one of the most vocal critics of the Chinese communist regime. He founded Apple Daily newspaper that spoke truth to power and became a beacon for the city's pro-democracy movement. For this, Hong Kong authorities are now attempting to paint my father, a newspaper publisher, as a dangerous traitor with charges of colluding with foreign forces and sedition. The trial is set for 80 days. It is being held with no jury but a panel of 3 judges handpicked by the city's chief executive. The UN Special Rapporteur on Torture last week called for an investigation into reports that evidence of one of the prosecution witnesses was obtained by torture. In spite of all of this, the Hong Kong authorities continue to insist that the city still upholds the rule of law and its judiciary remains independent. My father's trial is proof that neither holds true. Hong Kong is brazenly cracking down on its citizens' fundamental freedoms while lying to the world that it remains a rule of law complying jurisdiction. They do so on the assumption that democratic countries like Canada will turn a blind eye because of the size of China's economy. The authorities also draw confidence to do so from judges from democratic countries, including Canada, who continue to sit on the city's Court of Final Appeal. My father's show trial is a blatant perversion of Hong Kong's justice system to persecute one of the most ardent defenders of democracy. Canada has the power to hold the city accountable for ripping away these freedoms from its people. The pursuit of democracy is not a crime. And as a son, I hope that you can help save my father. Thank you.
Thank you, Monsieur Lay. Et maintenant, on passe.
Now we'll give the floor to Ms. Killan Gallagher. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I lead the international legal team for Jimmy Lai and for his son, Sebastian Lai, who you've just heard from. And I work along with my colleague, Jonathan Price, who's here today too with me. It's often said that journalists don't want to ever become the story. But Jimmy Lai has become the story, and it's one which the world needs to hear. It's the story you've just heard from his son, Sebastian, story of a hugely successful and self-made businessman who in 1989, so affected was he by the Tiananmen Square bloodshed that he decided to risk it all to speak truth to power and to stand up to human rights abuses and CCP corruption in Beijing. In my opening remarks, I want to highlight 3 themes about Jimmy Lai's detention. The first theme I will term lawfare, because Jimmy Lai was targeted for decades for doing his work. But it's only in the last 4 years that he's been imprisoned and Apple Daily, his newspaper, has been shut down, the printing press is silenced. And that's because what he's faced since 2020 is prosecutorial harassment, a barrage of spurious cases designed to silence him, weaponising the law. And make no mistake, this is lawfare. Now, that's something that I and Jonathan in our work increasingly see authoritarian states doing. Instead of states just using traditional legal tools to silence their critics, like defamation laws, cyber libel laws, or terrorism laws, we're now also seeing a wide range of other laws being used to try to silence people, regulatory, tax, fraud laws. And Mr. Lai's case is a paradigm example of this authoritarian tactic. He's been convicted in 4 separate sets of criminal proceedings, resulting from peaceful participation in protests and a Tiananmen Square vigil, and a wholly bogus fraud case about violation of a lease. But of course, the main and best-known legal weapon which he faces is the controversial national security law imposed by Beijing in June 2020. And what we're now seeing is the authorities wielding the twin weapons of the NSL and a colonial-era sedition law to try to silence critics. Using those legal weapons, they've ransacked libraries for undesirable books, imprisoned students for liking social media posts, even convicted authors of children's books about a flock of sheep resisting the tyrannical rule of a wolf pack. This is a dramatic decline of freedoms in a city which has a long and proud history of having enjoyed liberties unavailable in mainland China. Now, Jimmy Lai's NSL and sedition trial lays this bare. Every day in the trial, we see new ludicrous allegations. Just to give one example in opening, last week the prosecution made great play of the fact that Apple Daily, a newspaper, had, and I quote, news coverage almost every day of the umbrella movement. Newspaper reports news. That's the allegation. And in truth, it seems to us that Jimmy Lai is accused of 3 things: conspiracy to commit journalism, conspiracy to raise human rights concerns with human rights organisations like Hong Kong Watch, and conspiracy to raise political concerns with politicians, including members of IPAC. And frankly, these are not crimes. They are actions protected under international law, echoing the protections here in Canada in Section 2 of the Charter. And they're also actions which should remain protected under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Now, second theme I want to highlight is transnational repression. And that's the deeply concerning pattern of the Hong Kong and Chinese authorities no longer being content with doing what they can to silence critics within their own borders, but trying to use the long arm of the state to silence their critics wherever in the world they may be. And that's, of course, done through a range of threats and actions, including secret overseas police stations, bounties being put on the heads of individuals worldwide, with John Lee describing them as street rats who should be hunted down. And I'm acutely conscious that in 2021, the PRC imposed sanctions upon Canadian politicians, including this subcommittee, for daring to speak out about human rights abuses. Now, we're now seeing extraterritorial threats to prosecute those who support Jimmy Lai, including Sebastian Lai, a son speaking out for his father, and we on the international legal team for daring to raise concerns about human rights abuses before United Nations bodies. We've also seen a range of individuals outrageously named as alleged co-conspirators in the trial, including Luke de Pulford, who sits beside me, and Bill Browder. And the message to all of us is clear. We should leave Jimmy Lai to his fate. But we will not be bullied, and we know this subcommittee will not be bullied either. Third theme I want to turn to quickly is why Hong Kong is different to other authoritarian regimes. Because those issues I've raised so far, we hear them about other countries, Iran, Myanmar, Belarus, Russia. But the difference with Hong Kong is that it continues to maintain a fig leaf of rule of law, a facade of due process and business as usual. We've all seen the videos of Hong Kongers weeping in the rain as they kept vigil outside Apple Daily's offices on the last night of its printing, shining smartphone lights as makeshift candles in a poignant image which was then captured on the final cover. We all saw Hong Kongers queuing round the block to buy that final copy of Apple Daily, realising that the last newspaper that spoke truth to CCP power was dying, and with it a part of Hong Kong now. But now, what we see in Hong Kong is a bay of broken promises, the only financial capital to hold hundreds of political prisoners. As Congressman Mike Gallagher in the US has put it so powerfully, the bankers wear golden blindfolds as they look out to Victoria Harbour. And frankly, it's not only the bankers. All those who believe Hong Kong still complies with the rule of law must look more closely and look at what is happening to Jimmy Lai.
Excusez, Madame.
Sorry, ma'am. Members of the committee have to agree on this because she's taken an extra minute. Do you agree that we give her extra time? Yes.
Apologies, I'm sorry, I didn't see the 1 minute notice. As the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture made clear last week, she raised grave concerns regarding Jimmy Lai's trial because there are credible and publicly known allegations that one of the prosecution's key witnesses, Andy Lai, was tortured in mainland China and that his testimony against Jimmy Lai was coerced. All those who continue to prop up this bully regime must urgently reconsider. Jimmy Lai risked it all in 1989 to move into the media world, to speak truth to power. He remained in Hong Kong after the handover. He remained after 2019. He stood up for truth and for his fellow Hong Kongers, and now we must stand up for him. Thank you.
Merci, Madame.
Thank you, ma'am. Now I'll call on Mr. Luc de Pulfort from the Interparliamentary Alliance on China to speak for 5 minutes. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It's a privilege to appear before your committee as a witness and to be able to commit to Hansard the truth about what is happening to Jimmy Lai. Mr. Chair, just a few short years ago, the legal system in Hong Kong was internationally respected. Now, I believe it is accurate to describe that same legal system as a tool of the executive, an occasional weapon of political persecution. In my view, no case better exemplifies Hong Kong's dissent than that of Jimmy Lai. 3 features, I believe, of Mr. Lai's trial stand out as emblematic of Hong Kong's authoritarian decline. First feature, the government, aided and abetted by the prosecution and law enforcement, is engaging in malicious mischaracterization regarding Jimmy Lai, constructed a narrative about him which they know to be false. Second feature, to procure this narrative, coerced testimony will be relied upon. Third feature, attempts are being made to incriminate foreign nationals and blame them for inciting the 2019 unrest in Hong Kong. On the first point, malicious mischaracterization, the bald truth of Jimmy's case is that he is simply a character in a fabricated narrative. There are no crimes here, as you've heard so powerfully described by Keelan Gallagher KC. In essence, Beijing needs a mastermind to blame for the 2019 pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong, and Jimmy Lai is the best fit. That's it. So tragically for the Lai family, Jimmy is the person selected to bear the yoke of the mastermind behind this movement and everything that goes with it. This is false, of course. Beijing knows it to be false. And the prosecutors in the case know it to be false. It is self-evidently false on the basis of readily available evidence. So obviously false, in fact, that coerced testimony has to be deployed to make it seem true. The actual truth is that there is precious little evidence to connect Jimmy Lai to the predominantly youth-led democracy movement in Hong Kong. But in jurisdictions where the legal system has shown itself willing to yield to executive power, evidence can always be found. This is where the tragic story of Andy Lee enters this farce. Andy Lee, known to some on the committee, was arrested under the national security law in August 2020 for, inter alia, working with foreign politicians on Hong Kong. Shortly after, he tried to flee Taiwan with 11 others. The 12 were apprehended in Chinese waters and taken to Shenzhen prison in China, where things got very bad for them, especially Andy. The Washington Post reported last month, after a year-long investigation, and I quote, Most of the 12 were not physically abused, but 7 people familiar with the conditions at the centre said screaming could consistently be heard coming from one cell, Lee's. Since his time in Shenzhen, Andy has appeared as a key witness in Jimmy Lai's trial, to the surprise of nobody. But even Andy's testimony is not enough. If Jimmy has colluded with foreign forces, there have to be some forces with which he has colluded. This is why I, together with Global Magnitsky Justice founder Bill Browder and my Japanese colleague Shiori Kano, are named as co-conspirators with Jimmy Lai on his third charge, colluding with foreign forces to undermine national security. They want to try to claim that foreign forces, we, were somehow commissioned by Jimmy to undermine national security in Hong Kong. Mr. Chair, it gives me some satisfaction to be able to say to your committee and beyond that these allegations of collusion would not be a crime in any normal jurisdiction, nor would it be something to be ashamed of. But it is false. Jimmy Lai had nothing whatsoever to do with IPAC's founding or operations. I know because I've dotted every I and crossed every T. Were I to have had the opportunity to give evidence in these kangaroo proceedings in which I am named, but to which I have never been called, that is what I would have said. It's all invention or amplification of half-truth to suit Beijing's somewhat bizarre obsession with a mastermind narrative. I'm going to finish with this. It's tempting in such situations to forgive those who go along with authoritarian overreach as useful idiots. But that implies something passive, and I believe is far too generous a way to describe those involved here. The prosecution in Jimmy's case, led by Anthony Chow and Ivan Cheung, have not been passive. They are actively and enthusiastically colluding with the government to persecute Jimmy Lai. Chow and Cheung's conduct heaps shame upon the Hong Kong legal profession, trashing the legacy of many finer lawyers who went before them, grinding the rule of law, hard-earned by more courageous and principled men and women, underfoot. Chair, I think I'm over time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Luc. Et maintenant, j'invite Madame.
Thank you, Mr. Luke. Now I'd like to call on Ms. Ching Chang Lao, Senior Analyst, Interparliamentary Alliance on China. You have 5 minutes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Allow me to express gratitude to the committee for your commitment to upholding human rights around the world. I'd like to draw your attention to the rights and dignity of prisoners that are gravely at risk. The detention of Jimmy Lai is just the tip of the iceberg. As I speak, there are over 1,000 political prisoners like Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. The number of persons on remand who are unconvicted increased to a daily average of 2,600 in 2022, a 10-year high. Reports and testimonies reveal that political prisoners are particularly vulnerable, enduring harsh conditions and psychological pressure. I have sought to document mistreatment and detention in Hong Kong, have interviewed former inmates, and compiled credible information. Many testimonies are hard to verify. The information I'm about to present includes only the testimonies reported in credible Hong Kong source media, or that I collected myself from those who claim to have experienced mistreatment. If it would be helpful, I'd be happy to present the source on a confidential basis. One victim who refused to be named was beaten by a staff member to the extent that one of his testicles was burst. While he was fulfilling a punishment of doing push-ups, a correctional staff hit his groin repeatedly, inflicting permanent damage. Just last month, it was widely publicized that a correctional officer was involved in stabbing an 18-year-old male inmate in the anus with a wooden stick, resulting in perforation of the rectum. The victim will have to use a stoma for the rest of his life. The case was revealed by activists, and criminal proceedings have been initiated against the accused officer. Other widely reported mistreatment includes beating, applying mint paste to the genitals, being forced to crawl like a dog, to eat without cutlery, inmates forced to eat feces, forced to drink urine, and so on. And dehumanizing language focused on their political beliefs are also commonplace. Common words are riotous scum and cockroaches. I raise these cases to underline that mistreatment is common in Hong Kong detention facilities. And when you take into account that for most of the accused, their only crime is campaigning for democracy, the abuse seems all the more egregious. Routes of appeal and complaint do exist, but rarely lead to accountability. Being in prison, you can make a complaint to a justice of the peace while inspection. You can make a complaint to the warden or directly to the ombudsman's office. But none of these channels will lead to independent investigation, because the Complaints Committee is an internal organization where all members are appointed by the Commission of Correctional Services. Last year, the number of complaints received by Justice of the Peace was 42, which was a record low. Most of the complaints were referred to the Correctional Service Department for investigation, but none of them were further handled or discontinued. And even if a prisoner dared to make a complaint, he or she risked retaliation, that is, being put into solitary confinement. There were 2,905 to 3,181 cases involving prisoners sentenced to segregation as punishment each year from 2015 to 2019. Prolonged solitary confinement can be considered as torture. The UN Standard Minimum Rules for the treatment of prisoners state that it should be prohibited to hold a person in solitary confinement for more than 15 days. But there are reports that political prisoners have been locked up for more than a month, with different reasons for the punishment, like ranging from having an extra piece of bread, an extra packet of chocolate, or a pen in their possession. Again, these claims are widely reported in credible media in Hong Kong, predominantly in Chinese, however. For example, Chow Hung-tung, activist and human rights lawyer, had been held in solitary confinement 7 times in 9 consecutive months. Reasons include went on a hunger strike on the anniversary of the June 4th massacre, defended herself in court, or awarded a human rights prize, or receiving too many letters. A friend, Nicole Jung, was put into solitary confinement as retaliation because she lodged a judicial review to challenge the sexist arrangement where female inmates have to wear trousers all day despite weather, while male inmates have options. Another close friend, Gwyneth Ho, also suffered from solitary confinement repeatedly for saying things in court the correctional staff found objectionable. I have detailed what's happening to these people as accurately as I can, based upon credible sources, but I'd like to make a direct appeal to you today. To me, these are not simply people, brave people fighting for democracy thousands of miles away. These are my very, very close friends, suffering because the international community failed to keep its promise to Hong Kong. I'm aware of the leadership Canada has shown on the world stage when it comes to addressing human rights abuses or offering a home to those in need. As a friend of those in jail, as a Hong Konger, I ask you to show that leadership once again, where so many others have found themselves reluctant. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Cheng Wang.
Thank you. I will now call on Ms. Catherine Leung, Political Advisor. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My name is Catherine Leung, and I'm the Policy Advisor for Hong Kong Watch Canada. I appear before this committee today with a central message for Canada to call for the unconditional and immediate release of 76-year-old Jimmy Lai, the founder of Apple Daily, which was previously the most prominent pro-democracy newspaper in Hong Kong. I will use my time to focus on how Canada should be involved, what we have and haven't done, and next steps that Canada should take to reaffirm our commitment to human rights abroad and advocate for Jimmy's case. The charges against Jimmy Lai are not a reflection of any criminal conduct on his behalf, but of how Hong Kong, under the direction of the government in Beijing, is cracking down on fundamental rights and freedoms. Let me reiterate again that the allegations against Jimmy Lai are unfounded, politically driven, and indicative of a broader pattern of silencing dissent and curtailing freedom of the press in the region. Last week, the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture warned that evidence from a key prosecution witness in Lai's trial, Andy Lee, was obtained through torture. Other prosecution witnesses include former Apple Daily employees, including Chen Kim-hong, who accused Lai of, quote, portraying a negative image of the Chinese Communist Party with the hope of securing financial and political support from American readers, end quote. In January, the number of prosecution witnesses in Lai's case dropped from 60 to 14 without explanation. This is highly unusual and raises further concerns surrounding the fairness and politicization of Lai's trial. The Canadian Parliament has shown strong support for Jimmy Lai. At the start of Lai's trial in December 2023, the House and the Senate both unanimously adopted motions for the Hong Kong authorities to release Jimmy Lai and cease prosecuting him and others charged under the national security law. While we strongly welcome these initiatives from Parliament, it is important to note that the Government of Canada has yet to publicly call for his release. With that said, I urge the Government of Canada and its ministers to reflect the will of Parliament and call for the unconditional and immediate release of Jimmy Lai. This would align with Canada's historic commitments to being a champion of human rights and a defender of democratic principles, and the case of Jimmy Lai should be no different. It is also in line with Canada's Indo-Pacific strategy, which advocates pushing back against behaviours that undermine international norms, such as arbitrary detention. Jimmy Lai is a British citizen imprisoned in Hong Kong for exercising rights enshrined in Hong Kong's Basic Law, the region's mini-constitution based on principles laid out in the Sino-British Joint Declaration. Our allies have taken steps that Canada hasn't. Both the American and the British governments have urged the Hong Kong authorities to release Jimmy Lai. Canada should exert diplomatic pressure on the Chinese government in lockstep with our allies and clearly demonstrate our steadfast commitment to human rights and the rule of law in the region. It is also important to note that Canada has not placed any sanctions on Hong Kong officials. The U.S. has sanctioned 25 officials, both from the Hong Kong government and the National People's Congress of China, for, quote, undermining Hong Kong's autonomy and restricting the freedom of expression or assembly of the citizens of Hong Kong, end quote. I urge the Government of Canada to seriously consider using sanctions, particularly on Hong Kong Chief Executive John Lee, as a tool to hold the government of Hong Kong accountable for its human rights violations, including those against Jimmy Lai. We have a Magnitsky sanctions regime. It is important that we use it. To conclude, I urge the Canadian government to swiftly join its parliament to call for the immediate and unconditional release of Jimmy Lai, as well as all political prisoners in Hong Kong. The Canadian government should also implement sanctions on John Lee and other Hong Kong officials who are complicit in dismantling the independence of the judiciary and rule of law in Hong Kong. Now is the time to act before the end of Lai's trial and a jail sentence that could mean dying in prison. Thank you.
Merci, Madame Leong.
Thank you, Ms. Leong. Thank you for joining us here today. Thank you for your remarks. We will now move on to questions from members of the subcommittee. And for the first round, I'll call on Mr. Guinness to take the floor for 5 minutes. Go ahead, sir.
Thank all of the witnesses for your powerful testimony, and I particularly want to thank Mr. Sebastian Lai for sharing your powerful story and experience, for turning your personal grief into a moment of activism for justice and for freedom. Your father is such a personal hero of mine. I had the honor of meeting him in Hong Kong in 2017, and he left such a strong impression on me. Not just what he was fighting for, but also his character, the kind of person he was, and he is. And I want you to, if you're comfortable, share with us a little bit about his present condition, his disposition, and how he is responding to the situation.
Thank you very much for your very kind words. I haven't been able to go back to Hong Kong for the last 3 years because in speaking out on my father's behalf, there is unfortunately a risk that I could also be imprisoned. From my understanding, he at his age of 76 and having been in solitary confinement for the last 3 years, it does take a toll on a person psychologically and physically, but he's keeping strong, and he knows that in the end day he is he is doing the right thing. There's a story that I like to tell. When he was first arrested, they kept him for a day or two and then released him, and someone asked him, like, look, Jimmy, was it all worth it, knowing that you might be arrested again and spend the rest of your life in jail? Was all worth it? And he says, I was lying there on the cold prison floor and had a lot of time to myself. So I looked back over the last 30 years and I thought to myself, would I change anything? And he smiles and says, I wouldn't change a thing. So he's keeping strong.
And I know your father is a man of deep faith as well. And I'm sure that is a source of great strength for him as well.
Tremendously.
Thank you. Mr. Pulford, full disclosure, as you know, I'm one of the co-chairs of IPAC. I feel I should say that before I ask this question. I wonder if you could share a little bit more about what IPAC is and why IPAC has been targeted by Hong Kong authorities as part of this malicious prosecution.
Thank you very much indeed. Yes, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China is a cross-party international group of legislators spanning now 35 countries and really representing the breadth of political ideology and geographical location. It works on China, and it tries, as you know, Mr. Jennings, to determine something of a consensus on China from the perspective of democratic legislatures. This is something that Beijing does not like. So anybody working with IPAC members around the world will be seen as colluding with foreign forces for the purposes of the national security law. Certainly the activity of IPAC has really got up the noses of Beijing since day one. It isn't really until now that we've seen that turn into legal consequences for some of those involved within IPAC. But yes, now we are, with both Shori Kano and myself working for IPAC, having been named as co-conspirators in Jimmy's trial, and with Bill Browder, who I think has only been named because he briefed some Japanese politicians in IPAC. I think that's the only reason he's found his way into this trial at all. So it seems to me that we're now a bit of a target, regrettably. Thank you.
I think it is a tribute to your work and other IPAC legislators that you have attracted such ire, as your former Prime Minister Winston Churchill said, "You have enemies. Good. It means you've stood for something." I want to ask about the presence of former Canadian Supreme Court Justice Beverly McLaughlin on Hong Kong's Court of Final Appeal. Mr. Sebastian Lai has already spoken about this issue, critically of her continuing presence. She responded in a Globe and Mail story saying, quote, "The court is doing a terrific job of helping maintain rights for people insofar as the law permits it in Hong Kong." I wonder if any members of the panel want to react to that sentiment from a former Canadian judge.
Thank you, Mr. Jennings. I'd say any foreign judges who are serving on the Court of Final Appeal in Hong Kong should have left by now. The reason why they should is their presence in the Court of Final Appeal is giving the so-called rule of law a false legitimization that there is a rule of law, and they're just simply maintaining the facade of there might be rule of law in the system, be it in the criminal side of things or commercial side of things. And any comments saying that foreign judges remaining on the court would at least give some safeguards to the rule of law in Hong Kong is simply false. Just look at how many foreign judges actually got involved in national security law cases, and look at how Jimmy Lai's assets was being frozen simply because he wasn't convicted yet, but he was charged with the national security law. It's clear that there's no rule of law in the national security side of things, nor the commercial side of things. So I say all foreign judges should have left the court by now.
In 30 seconds I have left, does anybody else want to weigh in on the question of Justice McLaughlin's continuing presence?
Yeah, can I just say one thing about that? The problem with a foreign judge sitting in Hong Kong today is that they give a veneer of respectability to a system that has dissolved underneath the edifice of the rule of law. There is nothing there anymore, but it is dressing like the foreign judges. They still have, of course, the courtrooms. They still wear the robes. And I'm afraid, with no disrespect to her personally, Beverly McLaughlin has become part of that dressing. She's become part of the appearance of the rule of law, but she is not significantly contributing to its substance, much as she'd like to think that she is. And so she's probably doing more harm than good, although her individual contribution, I'm sure, is nothing short of excellent in what it is. But it's this appearance, this veneer that we think is doing the damage.
Now I'll call on Ms. Damov to speak for the next 7 minutes. Inaudible for the interpreter. Microphone is not on. 5 or 7 minutes. 7 minutes. The speaker's microphone is not on. Inaudible for the interpreter.
Mr. Lai, thank you so much for joining us in what I'm sure. Thank you to everyone, and Mr. Lai, thank you for being with us in what I'm sure is very difficult testimony for you to give. I want to focus my questions on freedom of the press, because freedom of the press, as we all know, is a fundamental pillar of a strong democracy. And I wonder if you could share with us the local media landscape in Hong Kong, how Apple Media fit into that, and maybe how it distinguished itself from competitors, and what the landscape is like now that Apple Daily is no longer able to publish. I don't know who wants to take that on.
I could.
Go ahead, Mr. Lai.
I could start, and then someone else could add. So current landscape is so my dad always had a saying that fear is the cheapest weapon that a autocratic regime has on its people, and that is very true for the current media landscape in Hong Kong. All the local medias have essentially been cowed. So the Cantonese language have been essentially co-opted by the government, and they did that by really making a huge show of the prosecution and persecution of Apple Daily and its journalists. For example, they sent 500 journalists to raid Apple Daily. 500 journalists, 500 policemen to raid Apple Daily, 500 policemen running into the newsroom, stopping people from working, taking laptops and hard drives. And that is a very strong sign of the Idi Amin quote. I could guarantee freedom of speech, but I can't guarantee freedom after speech. But I also think that's a testament to what Apple Daily was doing before, and its bravery and standing up to its belief, even to the point when it got very, very hard to do so. And so, Apple Daily, that's how it distinguished itself when it was first founded. It was a newspaper that spoke truth to power and wasn't afraid to criticize politicians and elites, and by doing so, obviously, was always on the side of the CCP and the Hong Kong government. And with the passing of the National Security Law, it finally gave them this weapon to crack down on Apple Daily and other pro-democracy activists and protesters.
Could I add to that too? Thank you. I suppose the first thing to say is that the decline in media freedom in Hong Kong has been very rapid and very precipitous. So if you look at, for example, Reporters Without Borders at their tables, we see that 10 years ago, Hong Kong was a bastion of free speech in the region, very high in the tables. Now, 2023, the most recent table, it's number 140 worldwide, so languishing towards the bottom of the table. And that reflects what's happened with a very sudden dismantling of what was a very vibrant media landscape. Now, Jimmy Lai's case and Apple Daily are emblematic of a wider decline. We look at what's happened with Stand News, for example. We look at what's happened also with foreign correspondents being denied visas when they're reporting in ways that the authorities don't like. And also with some media outlets like RTHK, once known for its fearless investigations, it now having pro-government management. So what we've seen is that media landscape being completely changed utterly in a very short space of time. It is worth also saying that in the last number of months, we've repeatedly seen when there's been criticism coming from UN special rapporteurs or from the Media Freedom Coalition. There was a very powerful statement from 24 countries in the Media Freedom Coalition over the Christmas period, and we're grateful to Canada for being one of the 24 countries that signed that, expressing concern about the decline in media freedom in Hong Kong. There was a very bombastic response from the authorities, claiming that media freedom is alive and well in Hong Kong and flourishing more than ever. Now, frankly, that's a black as white statement. It does not bear scrutiny when you, in fact, look at it. But they're repeatedly attempting to say, the same way they attempt to claim that they continue to have a rule of law, they're attempting to claim that it is still a vibrant media landscape. It simply is not true.
Without Borders is one of the witnesses that I would very much like to hear from when we're looking at this. So thank you so much for that. Over the course of the 26 years that Apple Daily was publishing, what impact do you think it had on the daily lives of people in Hong Kong?
As a Hong Konger growing up in Hong Kong, as long as I remember reading a newspaper, I was reading Apple Daily. That is the daily routine that I went through my father's briefcase, fish out the paper, which is too big for me at the time, and I kneel on the floor and then start reading it. And it gave me a concept of what's public policy and what's the politics in Hong Kong. And that's when I first knew about certain issues like the June 4th massacre or fighting for universal suffrage in Hong Kong. There have been criticism of the journalistic approach of the tabloid, for sure, but it is a very significant part of all our lives as Hong Kongers. Like, whether or not you like Apple Daily in general or not, this is the only printed pro-democracy tabloid you have in the city. And when there is huge social movement, Apple Daily is always there to talk about the issue, to try to dive into all of the issues. And growing up as an activist, the journalists from Apple Daily have always been supportive and friends towards the campaigns that a lot of the activists have led. So I'd say it's a very important thing. And a lot of the journalists who were from Apple Daily right now are facing unemployment or having difficulties entering the media industry again in other countries.
Merci, Madame Damoff. Time is over. Maintenant.
Thank you, Mr. Damoff. Your time is up. Now I'll call on Mr. Alexis Brunel Giuseppe. You have 7 minutes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to thank all the witnesses today. Special thanks to Sebastien, who is appearing virtually. It's nice to see you again, even if it's via video conference. I will not take a lot of your time because I would like to hear a lot from you so our analysts can come up with something robust following this meeting. Sebastien, I have a question for you. I would like to know the difficulties you have faced within the framework of your campaign to free your dad. Answer. Personally, talking about difficulties, well, do you mind if I answer in English? It doesn't matter. You can answer in English. Thank you.
Well, yes. So the personal risk are risks pertaining to, going back to Hong Kong, and also issues about, what can I say about my father or what can I not say about my father? In the end of the day, he is held in prison and has been for the last 3 years, and it has always been very ambiguous as to what crime he has or hasn't committed. They have really shown that the Hong Kong government has really shown in the last 4 years that it's a completely new playing field. I mean, who would have thought that the Hong Kong government would put bounties on people? Now, I personally do not have a bounty on me, but to what Keelan was saying, it is now a government that is fully aware and willing to use its status to crack down on all dissent and even criticism abroad. So, I mean, my risk is pretty simple. I cannot go back to Hong Kong because I might get arrested. But I repeat what my dad said. It is that idea of using fear to crack down on people in Hong Kong and abroad.
À ce moment-là, à quel point
To what extent is your dad's trial important for democracy and freedom of the press in Hong Kong?
So the trial, I mean, it's incredibly important because my dad represents a few different my dad represents a few different pieces of society. I mean, and because of how he was prosecuted, he represents the free press in this trial. He also represents someone who has supported the pro-democracy movement, someone who's given everything for the pro-democracy movement, but he also represents a businessman and a publisher. And essentially, all these functions that he holds are now being put on trial. It's impossible to put him in prison and say that you still have a free press, because all he did was publish the truth that was pro-democracy and critical of the government. And so, in a sense, Hong Kong is putting these values, the free press, freedom of speech, its rule of law, on trial with what they're doing to my father.
Merci. Je vais m'adresser à
Thank you. Let me now turn to Mr. Jimmy Lai's legal team. How important is it for Canada to take action on the file? Is this something you can use legally, or is it only through the media that you can use that, irrespective of any action that Canada takes? And if there is any action, so to speak, what would be the best?
Well, first of all, may I thank you personally for the moral clarity and leadership that you showed in relation to the unanimous consent motion in December. We're extremely grateful to you, to all the others who showed such leadership on that issue. And just to give a very practical example, the two resolutions of both houses in the Canadian Parliament before Christmas directly resulted in us then having, for the very first time, the opportunity for Sebastian and for us to meet with the UK's Foreign Secretary. Now, Sebastian and we had been asking the UK's Foreign Secretary to meet with us for 18 months. We'd asked Liz Truss, we'd asked James Cleverly, and we'd had no response. And finally, Lord Cameron met with Sebastian within days of what Canada had done. So it was not only important in itself, but it also had a domino effect in terms of securing more support. We've now seen the Canadian Parliament, the European Parliament, the US government, the UK government, and 4 UN experts call for the immediate and unconditional release of Jimmy Lai. Couldn't be more important. And the reason for that is that we do not have confidence, for all the reasons that Luke gave in his powerful testimony, we do not have any confidence in Jimmy Lai having a fair trial in Hong Kong. He's being prosecuted under a law which shouldn't exist, in a system which is profoundly unfair, and in a system where the National Security Chief has boasted of there being a 100% conviction rate. So that is why it's imperative that we ensure that there's a resolution of the case internationally, because we're not going to get an adequate resolution domestically within Hong Kong.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A question for Mr. de Belfort. You have an impressive network of parliamentarians in 35 countries. So it's somewhat tied to the question I've just put to the legal team. To what extent would the parliamentarians from the 35 countries who are under IPAC could see the action taken by Canada and replicate it in their own parliaments, in their own democratic systems? Is it possible, in your opinion?
Look, I think the truth is that, for whatever reason, diplomatic services in the Five Eyes and beyond are very reluctant to do anything which holds China to account for anything that it does. And it requires a lot of pressure, parliamentary pressure, in order to make that happen. In every single case where I have seen governmental action on China, and this includes for abuses of the Uyghurs in northwest China, but in many other examples too, and with Hong Kong, it has required significant public pressure and parliamentary pressure to get anything done. So what you have done is obviously very influential, but it hasn't been enough to result in accountability, which our governments still have yet to take any steps towards whatsoever. Thank you.
Merci, Monsieur Brunet-Duceppe. Et maintenant,
Thank you, Mr. Brunet-Duceppe. I will now call on Mr. Gord Jones to take the floor for 7 minutes.
I want to, again, like everybody on the committee, Mr. Lai, send my regards to you, to your family, to your father, and thank you for your courage during this really difficult time, and for your leadership as well. And everybody on the panel for the incredible important work that you do for human rights, justice, and for freedom and democracy. I'm just going to kind of follow my colleague, Mr. Brunet-Duceppe, on the questions around. We had the adopted motions in the House and in the Senate that called for the release of Mr. Lai. We saw the American and British, I think Ms. Gallagher cited the role and the bravery and courage that they've shown. And then I think, you know, Mr. de Pulford, you talked about the Five Eyes and the resistance and hesitancy, but some of them have stepped forward and taken a bolder position. What is the reluctance in Canada, and what you're hearing from, you know, your conversations and what you're seeing? Maybe Mr. de Pulford, if you want to lead on that, because we have seen others in the Five Eyes step forward and take a bolder position.
Well, you know, I'm talking slightly out of turn here as somebody from the United Kingdom. I don't want to seem as if I'm being too unfair on the on Global Affairs Canada, particularly when Global Affairs Canada have been very assertive and forward-leaning in so many of the policy positions. Look, what I would say is that I think the UK has been very slow to act on the case of Jimmy Lai. It's only very recently that they have declared him a British citizen, which he's always been. It took a lot of pressure to even extract those words. The meeting with the Foreign Secretary was very recent. And the UK, with China, were the two duty bearers under the Sino-British Joint Declaration. So the UK had way more skin in the game. But that doesn't excuse other governments for not being more assertive. I would just hope that Canada would follow suit, which I think they will if there is sufficient pressure. At least that's my hope.
Ms. Leung, maybe you could add to that, given that you understand the dynamics here. You've watched what the Americans have done in terms of taking a bit more of a courageous lead. Can you speak to, you know, in terms of what Canada should be doing and could be doing, and maybe why it's so important for the government in Canada to call for Mr. Lai's release?
Thank you for the question. The Government of Canada, as of today, has not called for the release of Jimmy Lai. Global Affairs has stated that it's monitoring the trials, but that's not enough. We need to take a firm stance and condemn the political persecution that can really hardly be described as a trial. What is happening to Jimmy Lai is a blatant political persecution and suppression of fundamental freedoms. Canada has always stood up for human rights, including in Hong Kong. There are 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong and 500,000 Hong Kongers in Canada. Our stake in the game is also people-to-people relations. There's always the risk that Canadians in Hong Kong may face the same kind of persecution, although maybe not to the same extent or the same kind of publicity. If we continue to allow this to happen without speaking up. The UK and the US have both called for Jimmy Lai's release. The UK statement came from David Cameron. The US statement came from the State Department. Canada has a resolution in Parliament, but our government has not taken a stance. And I think it's important for us to show clarity in where we stand on this issue and take leadership as well.
Can you speak in just maybe a bit more about what more the government can do beyond just condemning the situation, what we could be doing with the international community, and also just, you know, speaking about the fear of those 500,000 Canadians in Hong Kong and what this case is bringing to Canadians in Hong Kong right now?
Yeah, I think a step that the government of Canada must take is to sanction Hong Kong officials. We have a Magnitsky sanctions regime. We haven't used it at all on China. I don't know why we haven't. The US has sanctioned 25 officials, and it is important that we do the same. People like the chief executive of Hong Kong, John Lee, is directly complicit in the human rights violations that are happening, including that towards Jimmy Lai, people that are tortured to extract a certain statement from them, etc. And I should note as well that direction towards the Hong Kong government comes from Beijing, and our strategy towards the People's Republic of China will directly affect how the human rights situation in Hong Kong is dealt with.
Thank you. Ms. Gallagher, just following Ms. Leung's testimony around sanctions, we talked about John Lee. Is there others that you can highlight here today, Ms. Gallagher, that should be, sanctioned, like using the Magnitsky Act? We have legislation here in Canada to do that.
So may I return to you on the sanctions issue separately afterwards, just because I'll have to take instructions. But could I add something on the question about what more Canada could do? We entirely support the comments that have been made by Ms. Leung. And I would say there are three key things. The first is, of course, that the Canadian government can and should call unequivocally for Jimmy Lai's immediate release. They should do that publicly, but also in their bilateral engagement with China and with Hong Kong officials. Secondly, we'd ask that Canada also raise concerns about this case and what it represents in multilateral fora. In the next number of weeks, we have at the Human Rights Council the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture giving her annual report, and we would expect to see Canada raising the very grave concerns about Andy Lee and Jimmy Lai when they have an opportunity to speak in the interactive dialogue in respect of torture. And being silent, we think, would be the wrong thing to do there. But thirdly, we would say, and following what Ms. Leung has said, there are 300,000 Canadians in Hong Kong currently. There are over 200 Canadian companies in Hong Kong currently. And Jimmy Lai's case is a cautionary tale, because what we've seen is essentially state-sponsored theft of a business, hugely successful business, hugely successful media company, shut down by order of the executive. And every single Canadian company that is operating in Hong Kong with the current national security law and with sedition laws in place is risking action like that being taken against them. If any of their employees like a tweet that the authorities don't like, speak out of turn or stand up to the authorities. And that is something which is of grave concern for all Canadian businesses and all Canadian people who are currently in Hong Kong, and the Canadian government must speak out for them.
Merci, Monsieur Gord.
Thank you, Mr. Gord. Now we'll start our second turn. I'll call on Mr. Isasi to take the floor for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, thank you, Mr. Lai, and all of you here today. Very, very grateful for the incredible advocacy that you have done for a number of years now. Let me also express my great admiration for Mr. Lai. He truly was a paragon of courage and an individual who really stood up for his principles. So the image of Mr. Lai being arrested is one that I will never forget. The determination and his resolve to stand up for the principles of free journalism and the rule of law. Now, the first question I had would either be for Mr. Pulford or Ms. Gallagher. You did state that recently the United Kingdom actually did acknowledge that Mr. Lai has British citizenship. I suspect part of that was because they didn't want to play into the hand of the charges, which was unfounded, I should say, that Mr. Lai was conspiring with foreign governments. Now, the good news is that that has been acknowledged. Are they now espousing in any way, shape, or form the legal case on behalf of Mr. Lai? And what is it that you expect from the British government?
I'll be very brief. I had a meeting with the Minister in the UK the other day on this subject because I'd been named as a co-conspirator and asked them to make strong representations. They are, I think, like many countries, very reluctant to take any measures which seem as if they might draw or elicit a very robust response from Beijing. And unfortunately, that has become the constraint. What we'd like them to do is to issue a revised business risk advice to sanction individuals involved. You know, the US hasn't got anything like the skin in the game that the UK has, and they've sanctioned 25, as you've heard. Makes no sense. So the UK is lagging behind on those issues, at least. Over to you, Caleb.
thank you very much for the question. All too often what we see with political prisoners is that they have to fight a battle on two fronts. They've got to fight a battle with the country that's detaining them, but they also have to wade through treacle to get their own government to speak out for them. Now, regrettably, Sebastian and we and Jimmy Lai have had a long wait to get the UK government to speak out for Jimmy Lai, for their own national. We're very grateful for what Lord Cameron has now done and for the sea change that we're now seeing. And as I said, Canada played a key part in that before Christmas. That's very welcome. But it's essential that what they now do is they use the leverage they have. And one very serious concern that we have is that at the moment the UK government continues to speak out of two sides of its mouth. So when it comes to human rights and foreign policy, they'll raise concern about Jimmy Lai. But when it comes to trade and the economy, they don't. So we've seen repeatedly issues about Jimmy Lai and about human rights and civil liberties in Hong Kong being raised by foreign ministers, but then immediately afterwards there's a visit from a trade envoy, from a trade minister, attempting to say it's business as usual. And that's a real concern to us. And I should say it's also a concern in Canada, because whilst we've seen the powerful words that were used by Canada in the Media Freedom Coalition statement over Christmas, they didn't call for Jimmy Lai's release and go that far, but they did criticise what was happening in his case. But simultaneously, you do see the message that's still going to businesses in Canada that it's business as usual, this is a safe place to do business. And that's why Luke's call for there to be a business advisory is very important. The US government gives warning to US companies to say, if you're doing business in Hong Kong, here are serious risks to you, to your employees and to your employees' loved ones. Why does Canada not do the same? Why does the UK not do the same? And we're also speaking to the EU about why the EU has not yet issued a business advisory like that. They're all continuing as if we're still in 2015 and we're in 2024. The landscape is wholly different and businesses need to be warned about that.
Absolutely. Fair enough. Now, I understand that you are using all the legal tools at your disposal, both you, Ms. Gallagher, and Mr. Price. But I've only heard the UN rapporteur on torture mentioned, because did release a statement on how one of the individuals, Mr. Andy Lee, was forced to confess to this. But are there other UN bodies or special rapporteurs that we should attempt to persuade to take stronger action on this?
Thank you, Mr. Hassasi. A quick answer. Quick answer.
Yes, and I can give you more detail afterwards, but in short, we're waiting for a response from the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, who've already raised concerns directly with China last year. We've had 4 special rapporteurs call for Jimmy Lai's release. That's quite an unprecedented statement. I can give you the detail of each of the 4 special rapporteurs. So we're grateful for the support we've had so far from the UN, and it's very important that Canada reinforces that at the Human Rights Council session in March, when they'll have the opportunity to support us and to support the 4 special rapporteurs who've spoken out for his release.
Merci, Madame.
Des rapporteurs spéciaux. Alors, maintenant, je vais inviter Monsieur Magendel. I'm going to invite Mr. Magendel to speak for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Thanks for coming virtually to be part of this. I know that your presentation and the presentation of your team was very impressive to the opposition leader, Pierre Poilievre, during the December meeting. So thank you for being such a force of nature. I'll ask you the question, as well as your legal team. Why have they targeted Jimmy Lai? Why is the Chinese Communist Party so afraid of him?
Yeah. Dad showed an alternative in a few sense. He showed an alternative to the news with Apple Daily, a news that didn't have to cow to the government, didn't have to suck up to the elites. But he also showed an alternative that you didn't have to bend your knee to China to be successful, to do well in business in Hong Kong. And they didn't really like that. They didn't like someone that they aren't able to control, that they aren't able to bend. But then that's what that was for the last 30 years. And Hong Kong as well. The people of Hong Kong have shown themselves that they truly love these values of freedom. I mean, 2 million people showed up for a pro-democracy protest. That's 20-30% of the Hong Kong population. I mean, can we imagine that in anywhere else? That would be, you know, it would be absolutely crazy. But that is what Hong Kong was, and that is, you know, I think it's still in people's heart. But they have, that is what they're cracking down on, and my father is an amalgamation of all these things, where, you know, this stowaway that arrived in Hong Kong almost 6 years ago, who is now here fighting for his home and fighting for its freedoms.
If I can add to that, this is high stakes for Hong Kong and for China. They've picked on the biggest fish they could find, not the wealthiest. There are wealthier. As Sebastian says, there are wealthier men in Hong Kong who they didn't need to pick on because they'd already kowtowed to the Chinese government. But this is a man who embodied independence, the independent spirit, and freedoms of speech, freedoms of protest. And they found them all encapsulated into this one extraordinary man. And they recognised that if they could target him with a national security law successfully, that would send a very powerful message to all sorts of corners of Hong Kong, those people who might want to speak freely, those people who might want to trade freely, those people who might want to protest peacefully, all of these things that he did, they can crush in one go. That, as you know, the national security law has a 100% conviction rate, so they can be fairly sure that they will succeed, and they inevitably will. And the reason to target him with a national security law, and don't forget that they've already targeted him and convicted him under offences under the basic law, peaceful protest type offences, free speech type offences. But they introduced the national security law in 2020 in order to be able to infer that someone like Jimmy Lai presents a threat to national security. Nothing could be further from the truth. Jimmy Lai was standing up for the national security of Hong Kong. He was not a radical. He was seeking to maintain the status quo. The radicals are the Chinese authoritarians creeping in from the north. They want to change the way of life in Hong Kong, not someone like Jimmy Lai. And that's why the national security law is so pernicious, and that's why they've targeted him with it.
Thank you for that. That was extremely insightful. I'll take the minute that I have left to ask a question to Hong Kong Watch about what Canada can do. As you know, I used to be an advisor with the Harper government before the people of Canada asked us to leave, and I've been watching Apple Daily ever since. When you say sanction individuals, who do you have in mind, and why specifically?
Thank you for the question. I have here with me a list of 4 Hong Kong officials who hold property in Canada and who are directly involved with either supporting or implementing the national security law. First, I have Wong Kam Sing, the Secretary of Environment. He currently owns a property alongside his wife in Vancouver. As part of the Executive Council, he publicly supports and is responsible for collectively implementing the national security law. I also have Andrew Lam Siu Lo and Kennedy Wong Ying Ho. They're both members of the Patriots Only Legislative Council, and they currently own property in Canada. And I have Eliza Chan, a non-official member of the Executive Council, and she currently owns 2 apartments in Toronto. And she's part of the Chief Executive John Lee's cabinet, and she publicly supports the national security law. I'll note that these are just the people we know about. We have no way of knowing who else might hold property in Canada, and we urge the Canadian government to undertake an audit of the financial and personal connections that Hong Kong officials and their partners and spouses have in Canada, including, of course, the Chief Executive and his cabinet.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr.
Thank you very much.
J'invite maintenant M. Brunel.
Mr. Brunel Duceppe, you have 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. We want to thank the last 4 people who were named. I was just being ironic. Maybe humor from Quebec. Mr. Sebastien, I imagine that someone, what will happen if somebody right now in Hong Kong expresses support for your dad, is it possible? Can people dare to do that? If someone were to dare, what will happen to that person, in your opinion?
The feed is a bit grainy, so I didn't hear the full question. Was it about if someone could show open support to my father in Hong Kong? Yeah. Yeah. No. It would be incredibly hard to show open support to my father and anything related to democracy in Hong Kong. It's it's hard to describe the current climate, but suffice to say that all the freedoms that Hong Kong had that was taken granted for is no longer there. At one point, even holding a white piece of paper was something that was an issue. There's also the Tiananmen Square vigils that didn't happen last year. It was the only territory belonging to China where you could still commemorate and pay respect to people who died in Tiananmen Square, and that is no longer a thing anymore in Hong Kong. So I think that shows you exactly where Hong Kong is now.
Ça m'amène à une question pour Hong Kong Watch.
That takes me to a question for Hong Kong Watch. There's a large Canadian community here from Hong Kong. And a while ago, we talked about transnational crackdowns. Could that be a problem here for people here who express their support for Jimmy Lai?
Thank you for the question. Yes, 100%, definitely. I've heard cases firsthand. I've talked to people in the community who have told me that after attending even community events with the name Hong Konger in them, people showed up outside their home, took photos of them. And also, that's only the surface of it. I've heard cases from Hong Kongers who came here to Canada to escape political persecution in Hong Kong. After attending a pro-democracy rally in Canada, they returned home with flyers and stickers and posters of pro-democracy sentiments, put them up in their room that they're renting, and they were subsequently evicted for other reasons. Now, this individual found out later that the landlord was a core member of the United Front Work Department, and this is here on Canadian soil. So even besides the things we know about for foreign interference, like the overseas police stations or intimidation faced by community members, this is a day-to-day reality for Hong Kongers in Canada, of course, as well as Uyghurs, Tibetans, Falun Gong practitioners, and other dissident groups who have come to Canada in search of freedom only to find that the Chinese Communist Party's far-reaching hand is still here. So I really urge the government to take a more serious look at the community impact of transnational repression.
En fait, c'est une raison de plus pour le gouvernement canadien de...
That is another reason for the Canadian government to act when it comes to Hong Kongers who are on Canadian soil, who are suffering from transnational crackdown because they have expressed support for Jimmy Lai. I think that's an additional reason for Canada to act. Madam Gallagher, in your opening remarks, you talked about threats towards your own legal team. What were those threats?
Yes, thank you for the question, and I really support what's just been said by Ms. Leung about how serious this is. Sebastian and we as the legal team have faced a range of threats. When Sebastian dared to address the United Nations last year, he was interrupted by China. There then was a statement put out about him and our team from the Hong Kong SAR authorities, a formal statement. The Chinese state media has called me a notorious anti-China element a range of times. But one of the things which is most worrying is that I and my colleagues, in fact, particularly the women on my team, rather than Jonathan Jonathan, have been placed under intimidatory surveillance, both in the UK and internationally. It's happened to us at the United Nations building in Geneva. It was investigated by the security services in Geneva, and it was concluded that there were state agents who were following us around. Very intimidating. I've received repeatedly rape threats, death threats, threats of dismemberment to me and my children. It always happens on key days in relation to this case. So on days when I'm about to give evidence or give testimony, for example, I wake up to repeated attempts to hack my bank accounts, hack my emails, threats to me, threats to my family, state media criticising me, and then quite often we also get formal statements. Now, this is not about me or others. Primarily, we are concerned about Jimmy Lai, a 76-year-old man in prison for being a journalist and for being a pro-democracy campaigner. And every time I get those abusive threats to me or to my family or to members of my team, or any time they target Sebastian in the way that they have, it really makes us think that is how much they are out to get Jimmy Lai, that anyone who speaks out for him, a son speaking out for his father, a lawyer doing their job and bringing an appeal to the United Nations, if they're willing to put that amount of resource into targeting us, it gives you a real sense of just how much they want to ensure that Jimmy Lai is silenced.
Je veux juste remercier tout le monde. Je veux juste remercier.
I would like to thank Sebastian Lai. Thank you for being here. Thank you to all the witnesses. It was my last turn, so I wanted to thank you for coming. Right now, I'll call on Mr. Gord Jones to speak for 5 minutes.
Ms. Ching Kwang, you talked about the failures of the international community. And can you talk about what needs to happen at the international community, what Canada can do to help move things in terms of the failure there? And you want to elaborate?
There are promises that are made to Hong Kong, and at least in the Sino-British Joint Declaration, which is a treaty that's lodged at the United Nations and should be safeguarded by the Vienna Conventions, the law of the treaty. But the UK hasn't even raised an objection to it. None of the countries that are involved in that international law mechanism has actually done anything about the breach of the treaty. And there's a lot of things that could be done, as Catherine and Kaylin and Luke have said. But one thing that hasn't been mentioned is I urge Canada to seek to find a solution with other allies, with the UK, with America and other governments, to Beijing's unilateral rejection of dual nationality and racist imposition of Chinese citizenship of anyone they believe to be Chinese, even of those who have already renounced their Chinese citizenship, or those children of those who were born outside of China. They have been claiming that people are not subjected to consular access because they are first and foremost Chinese before they're Canadians or they're British citizens. And this has been causing quite some problem in Hong Kong. I'm sure the Canadian government have encountered similar issues, not only in the context of Hong Kong, but also in the context of prisoners in China, that they were denied consular access. And we can't just roll over and allow Beijing to deny consular access and rights. And at the same time, I completely agree with everything that have been mentioned on the panel, that there's so much things to be done, sanctions and so on. And talking about political prisoners and talking about the situation in Hong Kong and China at all times, whenever there's bilateral engagement or multilateral engagement, that should be a topic on the table. The Chinese government and the Hong Kong SDIR government have known to be quitting negotiations or conversations because these things are on the table. But that's exactly why it should be insisted on having those conversations, because you can't just refuse to talk about different things just because you don't like it or you've done something wrong.
Mr. Lai, would you like to add to that, given that you're advocating so strongly, obviously, for the release of your father, and you're dealing with multiple governments around the world, and maybe you can speak about some of the courageous moves some governments have taken and what we can do to advocate for you here in Canada. Sebastian, yeah.
Sorry, was that question addressed to me? Because I can't, my feed's cut.
Oh,
for some reason, I can't, I've been able to hear for the last 3 to 5 minutes.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
It's just very grainy. So Yeah, I'm very sorry about that. I don't know. I don't know why this is happening either. It's just suddenly. It's yeah. I'm so sorry.
We could have something quick.
Sure, if it's quick, yeah, because I do have a very short question for Ms. Leung as well.
Sure. I was just going to offer, if you'd like, we're in touch with him directly on text, so perhaps my colleague can send him a message with the question if you'd like us to do that. We're happy to add something, but if you want to use your time to direct... OK. I suppose the first thing to say is that we think that Jimmy Lai's name should be on every Canadian ambassador's lips around the world whenever they're engaging with China. Now, that's an important thing to do because it's vital that it's not only when there's a discussion specifically about human rights, but any time you have the Chinese delegation in Davos, you have the Chinese delegation that you had for China's UPR in Geneva, that Canada stands up for Jimmy Lai and for the issues that we've all been discussing today on every occasion. And also important that that happens when trade is on the table, because we know that one issue that China and Hong Kong really care about is the idea of Hong Kong continuing as an investment hub, a place where business can be done safely. And it is vitally important that the message gets through to them from Canada and from other like-minded states, that as long as they have Jimmy Lai, a Nelson Mandela type figure, behind bars, and they use the national security law in this way, they will not achieve that policy aim that they want of Hong Kong being an international investment hub and businesses continuing and businesses returning. That's a key point we must get across.
Mr. Chair, do I have a minute?
20 seconds.
Okay.
20 seconds.
Great. Just Ms. Leung, can you just underscore the importance of sanctions in Canada taking action?
Quick answer, please.
We view sanctions against other human rights violators. We should do the same for Hong Kong.
Et maintenant, je pense nous avons le temps.
I believe we have time for another turn, and we could give each person 4 minutes. I'll call on Madam Vanderbilt.
Mr. Chair, and I don't know if you can hear us, Mr. Sebastian Lai, but I want to thank you and also through you to your father for your incredible courage and your perseverance and your testimony here today. And that goes to all of the witnesses here today for your testimony and your courage. Thank you very, very much. I would like to pick up on something that you said, Ms. Gallagher, because it really struck me about authoritarians learning from each other and using tactics. And you know, you talked about weaponizing the law and prosecutorial harassment. It reminds me a little bit of the kinds of things that Maria Ressa in the Philippines is facing and others around the world. Could you tell us a little bit about how you are seeing these kinds of patterns where, you know, in one more authoritarian state, they use certain things and then they learn from one another and then they transmit that back?
Yeah, thank you very much. And thank you for raising Maria Ressa. Maria Ressa is my client, a Nobel Peace Prize winner in the Philippines, who's also been targeted for speaking truth to power. And her case has many overlaps with Jimmy Lai's, because what we see in those two cases is not just targeting one individual journalist, but attempting to shut down an entire media ecosystem, an entire media network. Apple Daily, in the case of Hong Kong, Rappler in the Philippines. We've seen that same tactic employed against Jose Ruben Zamora in Guatemala, the founder and owner of El Periodico, again, like Apple Daily, an anti-corruption, pro-democracy, pro-human rights newspaper. And similarly, we've seen that with Mir Shakil ur Rehman in Pakistan, the owner and founder of GeoTV. So this is now a trend which we're seeing, so lawfare being used. And one of the tactics which I'm increasingly seeing is using laws, regulatory laws, fraud laws against journalists or media owners. And the reason that they're used is because many people, when they see a defamation law being used, for example, against a piece of public interest journalism, know that there's something wrong with that. They instinctively recognise there's something wrong with that. But when they hear Maria Ressa being completely fraudulently called a tax evader, or when they hear Jimmy Lai being called a fraudster, some people may think there's no smoke without fire. So it's a tactic which is now being used because it damages not only the message, but it also damages the messenger. And what I would say about that is this is now a tactic which UN experts, NGOs such as CPJ, RSF, lawyers who work in this field like us, have been seeing for some years. And what we haven't yet seen is an organised response. Now, Canada has shown real leadership on media freedom issues through the Media Freedom Coalition and elsewhere. And we think it's time to recognise that the enemies of press freedom are organised. We have got to get organised too. And it is high time for us to recognise these tactics and trends that are being used and work out proactive ways to tackle them.
I'm glad you mentioned the Media Freedom Coalition because, I mean, as you said, Canada's been leading on that. And is there a way that we can break those tactics if we and expose them? I mean, I think the testimony today is one way that we can expose those kinds of tactics that are being used against journalists to silence free media.
I'm a great believer in the phrase sunlight is the best disinfectant. I do think that highlighting this as a tactic in itself is very important, and I'm very grateful to the subcommittee for doing that today. And of course you yourselves can use your parliamentary power to highlight this in a press release or in other ways through SO31s, resolutions, motions and so on, highlighting this. I think the Media Freedom Coalition is a good opportunity, and I think that is a place where you should see these tactics being highlighted. One of the difficulties, however, is things move very slowly in the Media Freedom Coalition, in part because there's such a wide range of states. And you see that in some ways with the statement that came out over Christmas. Good to have 24 states signing it, but then you end up with the lowest common denominator, so some more controversial or robust language is removed in order to ensure you get a large number of people signing on. So there are other ways to do that, and I'd be very happy to talk in more detail about how to do it. But these are now routine trends. We've got to get organised in dealing with them. One very practical thing that Canada can do is we're repeatedly seeing in these cases, and this happened in Jimmy Lai's case at an earlier stage, that trial monitoring is focused only on, for example, the defamation case or the national security law case. And we had to actually go to states to say, why are you not going to the protest cases? Why are you not going to the bogus fraud case, for example? But it took work for us to do that. And routinely people are still just going to the emblematic case using traditional legal tools and not to the others. So that's got to change.
Thank you, Madame. Thank you, Madame Van den Bent. J'invite Monsieur Gun.
Now I'll call on Mr. Guinness to take the floor for 4 minutes.
At some point to tell us more about some of the other important cases you're working on. I think that would be quite worthwhile. But I want to zero in my final time here on specific recommendations for the Government of Canada with respect to action on the Jimmy Lai case. We've heard from a number of you. I think there's a clear desire that there would be a statement from the government, from Minister Jolie, calling for the release of Jimmy Lai. I think we've heard that loud and clear. We've heard recommendations around sanctions for Mr. Lai's persecutors. I think that's an important takeaway as well. One thing that hasn't come up, but I know, Ms. Leung, you've done some work on this, is immigration measures. The reality is right now that we've had instances of people that are in Hong Kong that have been involved in the democracy movement that have faced bogus charges related to that, and they've had trouble coming to Canada because of criminality provisions that we have in our immigration laws that don't take into consideration the context of some of these charges. So I'm going to ask you to comment on your work in that regard in a minute. Addressing foreign interference and transnational repression is clearly a part of this picture, as there's a chilling effect beyond Hong Kong's borders. And then also, we've heard a bit, but I'd like to hear more about specific international legal mechanisms that can be triggered as a result of the violations of international law that Hong Kong authorities have been involved in particular, their disregard of the Sino-British Joint Declaration, but there may be other international law issues and mechanisms we can trigger. So, Ms. Leung, maybe just 30 seconds on your work on the immigration piece, and then I'll come to the legal team on international mechanisms.
Thank you for the question. On the immigration front, a lot of Hong Kongers who are newly released from prison or who have been charged but then not convicted, a barrier that they faced is the requirement for a police certificate. This is an issue because when you ask the Hong Kong police for a police certificate, it is signaling to them that you are planning to leave the territory. They might put you in custody again before you leave, or they might have you on some kind of a list to watch for. We know as well that people exiting Hong Kong have trouble moving their money from Hong Kong to overseas territories, so that is a concern as well. A problem with the police certificates as well, even if one might be able to get it, is that some convictions have Canadian law equivalents. So, for example, the wielding of a dangerous weapon, when that weapon in question might be an umbrella or a laser pointer or a pen, might look to an IRCC officer like a legitimate offense, but that is not the case. I have spoken to many MPs and IRCC officials, and they have assured me that Hong Kongers who have legitimate reason to believe that their persecution is political do have a way out and don't have to submit a police certificate if they make that clear in the application. However, not a lot of Hong Kongers know about this, and that's been a difficulty.
Thank you. Over to the legal team on specific international legal mechanisms that Canada could be involved in triggering.
Thank you. So first thing we would say is with the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, Canada can and we would welcome support in writing to and making a filing with the Working Group on Arbitrary Detention to raise concerns that Jimmy Lai is arbitrarily detained. So that's something that we would welcome and we would ask for support with. We can talk to you in more detail. Second and third items relate to the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture and the UN Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism. So the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Dr. Alice Edwards, is presenting her annual report, I believe, on the 12th of March in Geneva. Canada has a speaking slot in the interactive dialogue on that day. And we think, first of all, Canada should publicly raise concerns about the reliance upon coerced evidence obtained through torture and the absence of any investigation. So to be clear, as soon as you have a credible, reasonable suspicion of torture having been used, as a matter of international law, a state has an obligation to investigate that. Now, the Washington Post on the 17th of December published a very detailed piece, Shabani Matani, the journalist, after a one-year investigation, concluding that Andy Lee was tortured and that he has provided evidence against Jimmy Lai, having been coerced to do so. China has done absolutely nothing about that. Dr. Alice Edwards has written to China to say, why has there been no investigation? What are you doing about this? Why are you relying upon this man in Jimmy Lai's trial? They've yet to have a reply. She's spoken out about it publicly. Canada should be supporting her in that regard. We haven't yet seen any states supporting Dr. Alice Edwards in the statement she made last week. It's imperative they do so as quickly as possible, and we would certainly expect to see them do so on the 12th of March publicly. And last one is Special Rapporteur on Counter-Terrorism. The national security law is a misuse of counter-terrorism law by its very nature. Canada has said that in other fora. It should say it in the United Nations loud and clear when he has his annual report. I believe that is also on the 12th of March. So I think all eyes should be on what Canada does in Geneva in mid-March in relation to these issues. They are international mechanisms which can be used. There's an opportunity coming up within 5 weeks.
Thank you, Madame. Et maintenant, j'invite Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe.
Now, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, you have 4 minutes. Thank you for giving me another turn. Ms. Long, we are discussing this topic on the Immigration Committee. We talked about the police certificates in Hong Kong. You have an ally working with me, and we're continuing work on this. Mr. de Beaufort, there seems to be a pattern that democracies in Canada follow when there's a matter concerning China. Maybe in another country, if the Jimmy Lai issue were raised, something will have been done. But now we are dealing with Canada, and there's something that we're seeing. Why, in your opinion, and how can we destroy that pattern?
Well, thank you for the question. I think some in the administration here in Canada would legitimately seek the excuse that if the UK isn't moving as the principal duty holder under the Sino-British Joint Declaration with China, why should they? I've heard that argument. But actually the truth is, as Ching rightly said, that this is a treaty lodged at the United Nations, and that means that the duty bearers are actually all of us, including Canada. So I think you're right to point out that issue. Something which has not been mentioned, but something that Canada could certainly do. Hong Kong, bizarrely enough, remains a party to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which does have a dispute resolution mechanism. Any country could make a complaint under the ICCPR, and Canada should do so. They could do. It may well result in China withdrawing from the ICCPR, which I would foresee as pretty likely. But that is not a reason not to do it. A complaint put forward under the ICCPR is something they could certainly do and lead on. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur de Pelfort.
Thank you. My next question goes to Sébastien. Is the sound okay? Can you hear me now, Sébastien? Yes, the sound is better. This is really my last turn. If you have anything to tell the committee, you have the chance to do so now. You tell the committee whatever you want to tell the committee. Thank you very much, sir.
I first of all wanted to thank all of you again. It's what happened in Hong Kong really shows that what happened with Hong Kong, what's happening with my father is I believe a story of hope. It's a hope that all people are drawn to freedoms, the freedoms that you have in Canada. And there is this false narrative about it being East versus West, that these freedoms are all Western values. I mean, you could easily see that is not true. If you look at the passports of all the elites or all their children, they all hold British passport, Canadian passport, Australian passports. We have a government that says one thing and does another thing. And we have to show them, we have to show these people, the Hong Kong government, the government of China, that the freedoms that we have in the West are freedoms that we are, A, willing to defend them, and B, it's not a freedom that is traded like a currency. And it's also a human right. And so, I'm incredibly moved and so grateful that you are supporting my father and really doing right by the democratic values that underpin Canada. And I hope that you continue to do the same. And I just wanted to again thank all of you so much.
Merci, Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe. Maintenant.
Thank you, Mr. Brunel-Duceppe.
Anything that you haven't heard, or I know you've kind of been in and out of the conversation that you would like to add, that you'd like to call upon Canada and this committee and Canadians to help support the release of your father, to ensure that also this doesn't happen again?
Anything I'd like to add? Not particularly. It was I think everything that was said on panel was very very extensive and raised many good points. I think I've got nothing to add, but I'll think on that, and if I do, I'll send that over. Okay, if that's okay.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you, Mr. Lai.
Thank you, sir.
Ms. Gallagher, you talked about the Human Rights Council and the importance of the UN Human Rights Council meeting that's coming up. Can you just talk a little bit more about what Canada could be doing in taking leadership there?
So the upcoming Human Rights Council session is going to be looking at 4 topics which are relevant to what we've talked about today. The most important ones are probably torture and counter-terrorism, but there's also the Special Rapporteur on Peaceful Assembly. He's also giving his annual report, and the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights Defenders, who is someone who is looking at this issue of transnational repression, of critics of authoritarian states, the long arm of the state reaching out in the way that we've seen China doing. So that's 4 opportunities that Canada has to speak out on those issues. Now, as we saw recently with China's UPR, 161 states spoke. Canada raised human rights concerns, and we're grateful for that. But we saw real organisation with pro-China voices. So a whole range of states who gave boilerplate statements praising China in a number of ways. And we need to see much more organisation with states who have concerns about the issues that we've raised today. So the 24 countries who signed the Media Freedom Coalition statement raising concerns about Jimmy Lai's case and about media freedom in Hong Kong should be ensuring that they're organised before the Human Rights Council session. We think this is an opportunity for Canada to show real leadership, to shine a spotlight on these issues. Now, very practically, what they can do is, first of all, they can ensure that in the lead-up, in the 5 weeks in the lead-up to the Human Rights Council, that they're engaging with other states to see what other states are doing and to ensure that a spotlight is shone on these issues. Secondly, they should be preparing to engage with the Chinese delegation bilaterally when they're in Geneva, because that's an opportunity to speak bilaterally, raise these concerns, press home the messages that we've been speaking about. And thirdly, publicly, in their own time, which is even shorter than the times we have here, they usually get 2 minutes, 30 seconds, they should be highlighting these issues and this case and making sure that the international community is making its voice heard loud and clear and that China hears it. We know that China responds to what happens in the Human Rights Council. We've seen that in other cases. We've seen it have real leverage. We've also seen Canada, in other cases, secure release of political prisoners in other circumstances. And it's high time that we saw the international community doing all it can to ensure that Jimmy Lai is released before we see this British man die behind bars for being a journalist and for being a pro-democracy campaigner.
Ms. Leung, I've got about 30 seconds if there's anything that you'd like to add.
Thank you. I'll just reiterate the importance of Canada actually showing China and Hong Kong that there are consequences for their human rights violations. First of all, sanctions, as I've mentioned time and time again, we need to show them that they cannot get away with putting people in prison for really made-up reasons in a lot of the case, and other cases where they're exercising rights that they have in the case of Hong Kong. Another thing that I would like to underline is that Canada also must urge Canadian businesses to really carefully consider whether they want to continue doing business in Hong Kong. An international financial hub is not a place where one can get thrown behind bars for saying the wrong things. Hong Kong is deteriorating, its business environment is deteriorating, and the time to exit was yesterday. Thank you.
Merci beaucoup. Merci à nos...
Thank you very much. Thank you to all witnesses. Thank you for your testimonies and your participation in the study on the detention of Jimmy Lai in Hong Kong. We are grateful that you took the time to meet with us and to share your expertise on this important topic. If you have any additional information for the subcommittee, please contact the clerk. Thank you very much.
Et maintenant, pour le...
And now for members of the subcommittee, we'll take 2 or 3 minutes to talk about our next meeting, a special meeting to finalize our report.
Call the meeting back to order, please. Okay. Chers membres du Subcommittee,
Dear members of the subcommittee, before we conclude, I would like to hear your comments concerning planning for an additional meeting to study our draft report. Yes, sir.
I suggest, because from talking to different members, I don't think there's a lot of disagreement from what I've seen in the report so far. Is there any chance we could just tag it on to the next meeting and have like an extra half an hour? That way we don't have to come all the way, bring everyone together for a whole meeting. That would just be my suggestion.
Madame Padov.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I'm just tagging along with what Mr. Johns just said. I'm wondering if we could, I had asked if we could do an extra meeting with a couple of witnesses on this. I'm just wondering if we could do an hour with those additional witnesses, and then the second hour just finish up that report. I don't think it will probably take a full hour, but I don't want it to be, I also don't want it to be rushed.
Okay, we do have also another option. Si on peut prolonger la deuxième réunion.
If we could extend the next meeting for an additional 30 minutes so we conclude. It's up to you. What do you think about that proposal? Taking extra time during the next meeting?
Yeah, so if members are agreeable to this, if we take an hour and a half for the witnesses, and then we set aside an hour for concluding the report, and who knows, maybe we won't need it, but that seems like a reasonable way to meet in the middle.
Sorry. Absolutely, I concur with what Mr. Jenna said, but just wondering regarding the witnesses for this study, do we still have an opportunity to submit a couple of names or no? I just wanted to submit one name, actually.
No. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So I invited witnesses already based on the lists that were submitted. So there are 6. There's a panel of 6 that's shaping up. But if some of those decline, then there'll be openings. So you could send me additional names, and if there are names you previously submitted that you want to take off the list that you prefer, you can do that as well.
But if you recall, I did raise the name of this organization while we were discussing the matter last week, but I didn't officially submit a name for you.
What was the name of the organization?
Sorry?
What was the name of the organization?
It's a Canadian-based organization for freedom of expression. The
So
name escapes me right now, but I can email it to you.
You were talking about IFEX. Unfortunately, they emailed me during this meeting to decline the request. It was submitted by another member, so they're not available.
Oh, okay.
But they were invited.
It's a mute point then. Thank you.
La réunion est terminée. Merci à vous tous.
The meeting is adjourned. Thank you, everyone.